The recycled air in the sealed fallout shelter tasted perpetually of metal and ozone, a flavor that had become as familiar as my own tongue. It was a constant reminder of the 20 meters of reinforced concrete above my head, a silent, heavy promise of absolute isolation. Down here, beneath the desolate plains, the only light came from the banks of fluorescent tubes humming an incessant, low-frequency tune, painting the narrow corridors and my cramped workstation in a sterile, unchanging glow. I preferred it this way. The vast, indifferent blackness I studied felt less overwhelming when divorced from the fleeting, fragile blue of a natural sky. My life was a rhythm of data streams and caffeine, punctuated by the infrequent, crackling voice of a supply runner calling from the surface. Day in, day out, I sat before the console, a spider at the center of a web of screens, sifting through the galactic static, searching for the whisper of something new. My determination was a hardened core within me, honed by years of solitude and the relentless pursuit of understanding. I had dedicated my existence to mapping the universe's most distant echoes, to piecing together the story told by light that had traveled for eons. It was a lonely vigil, but one I cherished. The date on the corner of my primary monitor read 2247. The time was irrelevant down here. My internal clock was governed by the ebb and flow of data acquisition cycles. Just as I was about to initiate a routine spectral analysis of the Andromeda halo, a faint flicker snagged my attention. It was insignificant, barely a deviation from the expected noise floor, a single aberrant spike in a sea of predictable cosmic hum. I almost dismissed it, attributing it to a momentary instrument hiccup or a particularly energetic burst of solar wind, but something in its signature felt deliberate. My fingers, calloused from years of tapping keys, danced across the interface. I isolated the anomaly, routing it to a dedicated analysis subroutine. The initial readouts were perplexing. It wasn't a gamma-ray burst, nor a pulsar, nor any known astrophysical phenomenon. Its energy signature was too broadband, too diffuse, yet incredibly focused, like a whisper shouted across an impassable distance. I leaned closer, my breath fogging the cool glass of the monitor. The signal wasn't just a single spike. It was a complex series of nested frequencies, a pattern woven with an intricacy that defied random generation. It was structured, layered, like a piece of intricate lacework rendered in radio waves. My initial scientific excitement, the pure, unadulterated thrill of discovery, bubbled up. The preliminary triangulation data flashed on a secondary screen, confirming my growing disbelief. The signal wasn't coming from within our galaxy or even our local group. It wasn't even from within the observable universe. My heart began a slow, heavy thrum against my ribs. This wasn't just distant, it was beyond. Beyond the cosmic microwave background, beyond the very edge of what light could ever hope to reach. It was an origin point that, according to every known law of physics, should not exist. The implications were enormous, terrifying. I ran the triangulation again, feeding the data through multiple redundant algorithms, cross-referencing with archived sky surveys, even consulting the live feed from the surface array. Each calculation, each independent verification, pointed to the same impassable locus, a point in spacetime that was, by all accounts, inaccessible, unknowable, yet was now broadcasting. The signal itself began to evolve as I continued to process it. It wasn't static. The patterns shifted, reconfigured, growing exponentially in complexity. It wasn't just a series of pulses. It felt like information, compressed and layered in dimensions I couldn't yet unravel. My eyes strained at the screen, trying to perceive the underlying logic, the hidden grammar within the seemingly chaotic, yet deeply ordered flow. It was like staring at a fractal, each layer revealing a new, unexpected iteration of the whole, a self-referential geometry that twisted and turned upon itself. This wasn't just a scientific puzzle, it was an affront to everything I understood about reality. The signal wasn't just from somewhere impossible, it felt impossible. Its very structure seemed to bend the rules of perception, hinting at symmetries and asymmetries that my mind struggled to grasp. It was like trying to fit a sphere into a triangle, yet the sphere was undeniably there, singing its impossible song. My fingers hovered over the console, poised to share the data with the director on the surface, to unleash this anomaly upon the wider scientific community, but I hesitated. A primal instinct, deeper than my scientific training, urged caution. The signal wasn't just complex, it felt deliberate, like it was meant for me. The thrill of discovery had curdled into a tense, unsettling anticipation. What had I just woken, and why was it looking back? Down here, beneath the desolation of the surface, I was finally alone with it, the signal. My fingers, calloused from years spent manipulating delicate instrumentation, danced across the holographic interface of the primary analysis console. The room hummed with the quiet thrum of power converters and cooling fans, a symphony of purpose. I had spent the last 2 days calibrating, cross-referencing, and double-checking every sensor, every receiver, every line of code. No stone unturned, no variable unexamined. The raw data, a cascade of incomprehensible noise to any other mind, now flowed directly into my bespoke neural network algorithms. The signal itself was a paradox. My initial spectral analysis showed it occupying no single frequency band. It wasn't a pulse, not a continuous wave. It was both and neither. The waveforms on my display shimmered with an impossible complexity, shifting and reforming with a fluidity that defied known physics. Energy levels spiked and dropped with no discernible pattern, yet the overall integrity of the transmission remained utterly stable. It was as if the signal itself was rewriting the rules of its own propagation as it traveled. I leaned closer, my breath fogging the cool glass of the display. How could something be and not be at the same moment? My brain, trained in the elegant certainties of astrophysics, felt the first tremor of fundamental dissonance. I tried to impose order on the chaos. I fed it into every linguistic model, every cryptographical algorithm I had ever devised or studied. I tried simple frequency analysis, then complex Fourier transforms. I looked for patterns, for repetitions, for anything resembling a grammar or a syntax. The results were uniformly blank. The algorithms, designed to find order in even the most random static, returned nothing but error messages, or worse, perfectly flat lines, indicating an utter lack of structure by any human metric. It wasn't just noise, it was an absence of interpretable information, a void where meaning should reside. My frustration mounted, a tight knot in my gut. This wasn't just unknown, it was unknowable by conventional means. Then, a flicker, deep within the cascading data streams, past layers of what I had dismissed as pure quantum noise, my custom-built neural network flagged a sequence. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, a faint echo within the apparent randomness. I isolated it, magnified it. It wasn't a pattern in the traditional sense, no simple repetition, no predictable periodicity. Instead, it was a sequence of temporal shifts, of minute fluctuations in the signal's phase that seemed to relate to each other, not linearly, but in a way that suggested an underlying, non-random order. Like a shadow cast by an object I couldn't see, or the ripple left by a stone dropped into a pond, if the pond and the stone existed in a dimension I couldn't perceive. My spine prickled. This wasn't natural phenomena. This was intelligence. An intelligence that communicated not through symbols or sounds, but through the very fabric of spacetime itself. The thought sent a cold shiver down my arms, raising goosebumps. As I stared at the faint, shimmering patterns, a high-frequency hum began to needle at the edges of my hearing. It wasn't coming from the servers or the ventilation system. It was internal, a pressure behind my eardrums, a faint, almost subliminal whine that seemed to resonate with the shifting patterns on my screen. I pressed my palms against my temples, trying to clear it. But it persisted, a faint, metallic whine that nobody else in the world could possibly hear. Then, a sudden drop in temperature. I rubbed my hands together, looking around. The ambient temperature in the sealed fallout shelter was meticulously regulated, always a cool, dry 22 degrees Celsius. It was localized, sharp, as if someone had opened a freezer door just a foot away. I turned, scanning the instruments, but the thermal sensors registered no anomaly. Only I felt it. My heart hammered against my ribs, a dull, frantic drum. The hum intensified slightly, a subtle vibration in my skull. My mind, usually a fortress of logic and reason, felt a hairline crack appear, a tiny fissure through which a strange, unsettling draft began to blow. This wasn't just a signal, it was an intrusion, and it was reaching for me, not through my instruments, but through my very senses. Down here, beneath the desolate surface, the only true sound was the low, steady thrum of the life support systems, a monotonous pulse that had begun to feel less like machinery and more like a heartbeat, my own, amplified and distorted. I had been working for what felt like an eternity, the hours blurring into a seamless, obsessive pursuit. My eyes, gritty and burning, were fixed on the primary monitor, tracing the impassable contours of the signal's geometry. It wasn't just complex, it was wrong. Every projection, every data visualization I coaxed from the raw input defied the very principles of space and dimension I had spent my life studying. Lines converged where they shouldn't, angles warped and folded in on themselves without intersecting, shapes existed in states of simultaneous presence and absence. It was like trying to map the surface of a dream onto a blueprint for a tangible structure. Impossible, I murmured, the word a dry rasp in my throat. I reached for the lukewarm mug of synthetic coffee, my fingers brushing against the worn plastic. The liquid tasted like ash and regret. Yet the impossibility was precisely what fueled me. This wasn't just a puzzle, it was a window into something fundamental, something that laughed at the neat, predictable universe we thought we knew. My bespoke algorithms, designed to process and visualize data from beyond the visible spectrum, struggled to render the signal's true form. Each new iteration of code, each adjustment to the parameters, brought me closer to understanding its underlying structure, but further from any semblance of comfortable reality. The patterns were intricate, a lacework of impossible connections, and as I mapped them, I felt a subtle shift in my own perception. It began subtly, an almost imperceptible flicker at the edge of my vision. A rack of servers. Their indicator lights a dull red glow against the metallic walls of the sealed fallout shelter seemed to shimmer. I rubbed my eyes, dismissing it as fatigue. The shelter's lighting, a harsh, fluorescent glare, was hardly conducive to clarity. But then, a moment later, as I leaned back, stretching the knots from my neck, I caught it again. The primary monitor, a flat, rectangular panel, seemed to bulge slightly in the center, a convex distortion that made the intricate data patterns appear to swell towards me. I blinked, and it flattened, returning to its usual two-dimensional self. My breath hitched. "Just tired, Raj," I told myself, the sound of my own voice startling in the quiet. I turned back to the screen, forcing my focus. But the shifts continued, growing bolder, less easily dismissed. The shadows cast by the equipment, usually sharp and defined against the gray floor, began to deepen unnaturally. They stretched, elongated, twisting into forms that didn't quite match the objects creating them. A shadow from the arm of my chair seemed to detach, a darker, amorphous blotch that pulsed faintly before receding back into its source. The metallic walls themselves, a constant, reassuring presence, occasionally appeared to ripple, like water disturbed by an unseen current. I would stare, unblinking, until my eyes watered and the illusion would disperse, leaving me questioning what I had truly seen. My hands, resting on the console, felt strangely distant, their familiar shape somehow alien. Sleep, when it finally claimed me, was not a reprieve. My cot, a simple canvas rectangle, felt like a raft adrift on an ocean of shifting dimensions. The dreams were vivid, profoundly real, not just visual but tactile, auditory, even olfactory. I was in spaces that defied geometry, rooms with more than 4 walls, corridors that spiraled inwards to a point that was also their beginning, staircases that ascended and descended simultaneously. I saw impossible colors, heard frequencies that grated against some internal organ I didn't know I possessed. Figures, indistinct and vast, moved through these non-Euclidean landscapes, their presence a crushing weight, their forms suggesting an architecture of thought rather than flesh. I would wake with a gasp, my body slick with cold sweat, the metallic tang of the recycled air thick in my mouth, the hum of the systems a distant, mocking echo of the impossible sounds from my slumber. For a few terrifying moments, the sealed fallout shelter itself would seem to retain the dream's warping, the corners of the room not quite right, the ceiling too low, the floor sloping imperceptibly. Each time I would force myself to sit up, to breathe, to re-anchor myself in the tangible. I would run my hands over the cool, hard surfaces of my console, feeling the familiar texture of the keys, the smooth glass of the monitors. But the feeling of being unmade, of reality itself being a suggestion rather than a constant, lingered like a phantom limb. The signal was doing this. It wasn't just data I was analyzing, it was an active force, an intelligence that rewrote the very rules of perception. This wasn't madness, This was discovery. I had stumbled upon something beyond human comprehension. And though it gnawed at the edges of my sanity, I couldn't turn away. I had to understand. I had to map every impossible angle, every shifting dimension. Even if it meant the sealed fallout shelter, my sanctuary, became a cage of warped perceptions, I would continue. The signal beckoned, and I, Raj, was compelled to answer. Down here, beneath the desolate plains, the signal pulsed, a silent, insistent drumbeat against the inside of my skull. For days, I had wrestled with its impossible geometry, its non-Euclidean logic that folded space and time into shapes my mind struggled to contain, yet could not ignore. My fingers hovered over the comms panel, a relic of analog simplicity amidst the digital sophistication of my primary consoles. A single, heavily encrypted satellite link, my only thread to the outside world. The thought of sharing this, of laying bare the incomprehensible truth that had begun to rewrite the very architecture of my perception, filled me with a strange cocktail of terror and desperate hope. Terror, because I feared their dismissal. Hope, because perhaps, just perhaps, another mind, a brilliant one, could see what I was seeing. I punched in the sequence for the former mentor's private line. Each ring echoed in my ears, amplified by the pressure building behind my eyes. Then, a click. A voice, familiar and steady, but edged with a weariness I hadn't noticed before. "Raj, is that really you?" the former mentor asked, their tone laced with surprise. "It's been months. Is everything all right down there?" "No," I heard myself say, the word sharp, unbidden. "No, it's not all right. It's something else, something monumental." My voice trembled, a betrayal of the calm I desperately tried to project. "I've made a discovery. It's not just a signal, a structure. Living geometry." A beat of silence stretched, thick with unspoken questions. "A living geometry, Raj? Can you elaborate?" The former mentor's voice was careful now, the surprise replaced by a measured neutrality. "It defies all known physics." I pressed on, leaning closer to the microphone, my breath fogging the metal. "It's not propagating through space. It's creating space. Or rather, it's demonstrating that the space we perceive, the Euclidean framework we rely on, is merely a subset of a much larger, impossibly complex reality. It's like trying to explain a three-dimensional object to a creature that only knows two." I paused, searching for the right words, for any words that wouldn't sound like the ramblings of a madman. My instruments, they register discrepancies, not errors, but impossible readings, negative distances, curvatures that fold back on themselves without intersection. But my mind is starting to see it, to feel it. I could almost hear the former mentor's mind working, sifting through my words, trying to reconcile them with known science. "Raj," they began, their voice softer now, infused with a new, unwelcome compassion. "I've been isolated for a very long time. Are I sure this isn't a product of that isolation? The human mind, under prolonged sensory deprivation, can play tricks, invent patterns where none exist. Tricks," I scoffed, a bitter laugh escaping me. "My instruments, the most sensitive ever built, are registering these tricks. The data is irrefutable. It's the interpretation that's the challenge. But the signal itself, it's changing my perception. It's showing me the seams of reality, the places where our understanding breaks down. I've seen they shift, just at the corner of my eye, imperceptible until I've been shown how to see it." "Raj, listen to me," the former mentor said, their voice firm now, the compassion hardening into something more akin to concern. "This sounds like profound stress, perhaps even a break from reality. I urge I to consider coming out. We can arrange for I to be debriefed, to get some rest. I've pushed myself too far." "I don't understand," I pleaded, my voice cracking. "No one understands. This isn't stress. This is truth. A terrifying, beautiful, alien truth that redefines everything. If I come out, who will observe it? Who will try to comprehend it? It's rewriting me, molding me to its own image, so that I can finally grasp its true nature. I'm the only one who can see it now." The former mentor sighed, a sound that resonated with deep disappointment and finality. "Raj, I'm sorry, I can't help I with this. What I read describing, it falls outside the realm of scientific inquiry. I can only offer I help if I choose to step away from this obsession." Line went dead, a sudden, brutal cut. My hand remained on the comms panel, numb, the cold metal a stark contrast to the burning frustration in my chest. They didn't see it. They couldn't. Their minds were too rigid, too steeped in the familiar Euclidean world. They dismissed me not because my findings were false, but because their reality simply had no room for them. I was truly, utterly alone in this. The signal, this ancient, impassable intelligence, had chosen me. Or perhaps had simply found me, and now it was only my mind that could trace its impassable contours. This wasn't a setback, it was a confirmation. The world outside was blind, but I, in my sealed fallout shelter, was beginning to see. And as I turned back to my consoles, the flickering readouts of impassable data, I noticed the shadow cast by my own hand seemed to ripple, distorting the familiar lines of my fingers into something subtly, unsettlingly alien. The line went dead, a sudden, brutal cut. The silence that followed was heavier than before, suffocating. They didn't see it, they couldn't. Their minds were too rigid, too steeped in their narrow, comfortable understanding of the universe. I knew what I had. I knew what I was hearing, what was bleeding through the fabric of everything. I pushed away from the console, the chair scraping on the concrete floor of the sealed fallout shelter. The sound was wrong, not just loud, but resonant, as if the air itself had solidified into crystal and shattered. My ears rang with the echo long after the sound should have died. I blinked, trying to clear the lingering image of the comms panel in my vision. The red indicator light, usually a sharp, precise ruby, seemed to bleed at the edges, a blurry crimson halo that pulsed with a rhythm independent of any power cycle. It made my eyes ache. I ran a hand over my face, the stubble rough against my palm. The sensation was foreign, too coarse, like steel wool. My own skin felt alien, stretched and thin, not quite my own. I tried to focus on the familiar hum of the air filtration system in the sealed fallout shelter, the steady thrum that had been my constant companion for weeks. But even that was off. It was less a hum and more a low growl, a guttural vibration that seemed to originate not from the machinery, but from within the very walls, deep in the concrete and steel. I walked to the small kitchenette area, my footsteps unnaturally heavy, each thud against the floor sending a jarring tremor through my bones. The fluorescent lights overhead, typically a stark, cool white, now cast a sickly, jaundiced glow. The white plastic of the counter gleamed with an unsettling yellow tint, and the metallic sheen of the kettle looked dull, almost rusted, though I knew it was polished stainless steel. Everything was subtly, terrifyingly wrong. I poured myself a glass of water from the dispenser. The water itself, usually clear and inviting, had a faint, iridescent shimmer like oil on a puddle. I hesitated, watching the surface tension ripple, then brought it to my lips. It tasted flat, metallic like old pennies, and left a chalky residue on my tongue. I swallowed anyway, the action feeling dry, forced. Sleep didn't come easily. The distortions followed me into the cramped cot. The rough blanket felt like sandpaper against my skin, the pillow too soft, too yielding, like my head was sinking into something viscous. When I finally drifted, it wasn't into rest, but into a kaleidoscope of impassable geometry. I was falling, endlessly falling, through spaces that had no up or down, no left or right. The colors were not colors I knew, but vast, shifting spectra that burned my retinas even within the dream. There were forms, colossal and fluid, that twisted and reconfigured themselves, defying any Euclidean understanding. They weren't creatures, not in any sense I could grasp, but vast, conscious structures of pure thought, and they were observing me. I felt their gaze, not on my physical self, but on the very scaffolding of my mind, probing, dissecting, dismantling. My memories flickered like dying embers, faces dissolving into abstract patterns, names becoming meaningless sounds. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my throat. My body was a vessel, my consciousness a tiny, flickering flame in an infinite, indifferent void. The fluorescent lights were off, leaving me in the dim glow of the emergency path lights along the floor. It was teeming with the afterimages of my dream. The impassable geometries pulsed in the air, a faint, shimmering lattice superimposed over the familiar concrete walls. The air itself felt thick, heavy, as if permeated by some unseen, immense pressure. I swung my legs off the cart, my bare feet hitting the cold floor. I looked down, confused. The floor looked normal, just plain gray concrete. I stumbled to the comms console, desperate for the familiar. My fingers brushed the smooth metal. It felt porous, like I was touching a sponge or something organic that yielded slightly under my touch. I recoiled, staring at my fingertips. They looked normal, no visible change. Yet the memory of that unnatural texture lingered. A phantom sensation. I activated the main lights. The jaundiced glow returned, painting the sealed fallout shelter in its sickly hue. I looked at the digital clock on the console. 3 hours had passed since I lay down, 3 hours of that waking nightmare. The lines were blurring. The impossible forms from my dreams seemed to cling to the periphery of my vision, retreating when I tried to focus, only to reappear in the corners of my eye. The low growl of the air system was louder now, a constant, menacing presence. I walked to the small mirror I kept near the cot. My reflection stared back, but it wasn't quite right. My features seemed to stretch and contract, a slight ripple across the surface of my face, like water disturbed by a stone. For a moment, my skin appeared translucent, revealing faint, impossible patterns beneath. Then it snapped back, just my tired, pale face staring back. I gripped the edge of the cart, my grip tight. This wasn't just stress. This wasn't fatigue. This was something deeper, something fundamental being rewritten. The signal, the impossible signal, was not just a transmission of data. It was a solvent, dissolving the very medium of my perception. It was eroding my senses, one by one, replacing the objective world with its own alien truth. And the terrifying part, they didn't see it. They couldn't. Their minds were too rigid, too steeped in the comforting lies of observable reality. But I was here, in the sealed fallout shelter, where the only truth was the ceaseless whisper from beyond. A tremor ran through me, not of fear, but of a fierce, desperate resolve. If they wouldn't listen, I would show them, not with equations or graphs, but with the raw, undeniable evidence of what was happening. I turned from the dead console, the faint hum of the air recyclers, the only sound breaking the thick quiet. A gaze fell upon the monitors, a constellation of shimmering waveforms and alien spectra, each one a tendril of the signal. It pulsed, a silent, rhythmic beat that had begun to feel more like my own heart than anything else. I settled back into the worn chair, my fingers hovering over the interface. My eyes, gritty from days without proper sleep, scanned the data streams. The signal was a tapestry of impossible frequencies, a symphony of non-existent notes. For weeks, I had tried to deconstruct it, to force it into the familiar boxes of human understanding. But it resisted, shifting, mocking my every attempt at logic. Now a different approach felt inevitable. The subtle undulations of one particular waveform caught my attention. It wasn't just a pattern, it was a language. Not of sounds nor of symbols, but of pure, unadulterated concept. It bypassed the auditory cortex, sidestepped the visual. It spoke directly to something deeper, something primal within the fabric of my own consciousness. A strange sensation bloomed behind my eyes, a pressure that was both painful and exhilarating. It was as if a new sensory organ was unfurling within my skull, struggling to interpret the influx of alien data. The lines on the screen blurred, coalesced, and then, for a fleeting, terrifying instant, I saw it, not with my eyes, but with something else. A flash of impossible geometry, a structure that defied 3 dimensions, folded in on itself in a way that should have shattered my mind. My internal monologue, usually a precise instrument of scientific inquiry, began to fray. This is not understanding, a part of me screamed, this is assimilation. The words felt wrong, heavy, as if they were being spoken by a different tongue, a different mind. My own thoughts echoed back to me, distorted, layered with unfamiliar resonance. I tried to grasp a coherent idea, to form a question, but the concepts themselves seemed to slip, reform, and then solidify into something utterly alien. I watched the clock on the wall, or rather, I tried to. The digital display seemed to stutter, the numbers blurring into a meaningless smear before snapping back into focus. 5 minutes, then 20. Then, suddenly, it felt like an hour had passed, yet the clock insisted it had only been seconds. My sense of linear progression, the comforting march of cause and effect, began to unravel. Was I moving through time, or was time moving through me? Or perhaps both were illusions, mere constructs the signal was systematically dismantling. This wasn't a discovery, it was an invasion. The signal wasn't just transmitting information, it was implanting it, rewriting the very syntax of my perception. They were not images, they were truths, self-evident and horrifying in their implications. I opened my eyes, a gasp catching in my throat. The waveforms on the monitor were no longer just data. They were moving, flowing like living entities. They seemed to reach out to beckon. It was teeming, and it was speaking, and now I was beginning to hear. My hands, without conscious command, reached for the headphones. The static hiss filled my ears, then the low, resonant thrum of the signal. This time, it wasn't just a hum. It was a chorus of impossible frequencies, each one a different facet of a singular, vast intelligence. And within that chorus, I began to discern individual voices, not speaking words, but radiating pure, unadulterated concepts. Concepts of existence outside of spatial and temporal constraints. Concepts of being that rendered human life a mere flicker in an incomprehensible eternity. My own name, Raj, felt like a foreign sound, a fragile label struggling against an immense, crushing weight of new understanding. Who was Raj? A collection of memories, a bundle of perceptions. The signal was showing me how easily those could be unmade, rewoven into something else entirely. My past, my research, my very identity, they felt like flimsy constructs, paper-thin against the vastness that was now pouring into me. A thought, not my own, but now undeniably part of me. Surfaced, the error was in seeking the origin. The origin is the destination. My knuckles were white, clutching the headphones. The sealed fallout shelter, once my sanctuary, now felt like a fragile shell, barely containing the immensity that was unfolding within my skull. The understanding wasn't a triumph, it was a dissolution. The line had gone dead, a sudden, brutal cut. They didn't see it. They couldn't. Their minds were too rigid, too steeped in the Euclidean prison of their own making. The silence that followed was heavier than before, suffocating, pressing in on me within the confines of the sealed fallout shelter. I pushed away from the console, the swivel chair groaning under my weight. A tremor ran through the floor, a subtle vibration that I dismissed as the distant hum of the ventilation system, but it felt wrong, like the very foundation of the sealed fallout shelter was shifting beneath my feet. I walked to the central observation window, a reinforced pane designed to withstand atmospheric pressure, though here, deep underground, it only looked out onto a concrete wall, or it usually did. Now, a shimmering, almost gelatinous distortion rippled across the concrete surface. It wasn't a reflection. There was no light source to create such an effect. It was as if the wall itself was breathing, its flat plane momentarily twisting into a concave curve, then bulging outwards, the angles of its corners dissolving into soft, impassable arcs. My breath hitched. I blinked, rubbed my eyes hard. When I looked again, the wall was flat, gray, utterly unremarkable, but the image, that brief, sickening warp, was seared into my retina. A metallic clang echoed from the far end of the sealed fallout shelter, near the supply lockers. I spun around, my heart racing. Nothing. Just the rows of neatly stacked crates, the emergency rations, the spare parts for the primary server. Yet in my periphery, a shadow detached itself from a stack of medical supplies, a tall, gaunt outline that seemed to stretch and contort, its edges blurred before it simply wasn't there. My mind was playing tricks, I told myself, the isolation, the stress. But the conviction felt brittle. I needed coffee. A simple, grounding ritual. I walked to the small kitchenette area, my footsteps echoing a little too loudly. The old ceramic mug, chipped at the rim, sat on the counter where I'd left it. I reached for it, my fingers brushing against empty air. It wasn't there. My hand passed through the space it occupied. I froze, retracting my hand as if burned. I looked again. The mug was there, solid, real. I snatched it, my grip tight, and poured the lukewarm, bitter liquid, my hand trembling slightly. This wasn't just exhaustion. This was something else entirely. The signal, it was doing this. Not just to the data, not just to my understanding, but to my very perception of the physical world. I walked back towards the main console, needing to check the signal again, to see if the patterns had shifted, if the impossible geometries I was now seeing correlated to the non-Euclidean data streams. As I passed the heavy steel door that led to the auxiliary power room, I noticed it. The door frame, a solid, right-angled structure for years, now possessed a subtle, almost imperceptible skew. The top right corner seemed to lean inward, creating an angle that was acutely less than 90 degrees, while the bottom left had expanded, pushing outwards. The entire frame looked like it had been stretched and twisted, though the door itself remained perfectly rectangular within it. It was a visual paradox, a violation of fundamental geometry. My stomach churned. I ran my hand over the warped metal. It felt solid, unyielding. But my eyes insisted it was wrong. I pushed the door open, a grating sound filling the air. Inside, the auxiliary room looked normal, but as I stepped across the threshold, the floor seemed to dip beneath my weight, not a structural give, but a spatial distortion. The far wall, where the backup generator hummed, seemed to recede, stretching further away even as I walked towards it, the dimensions of the small room expanding and contracting with each step. Panic began to coil in my gut. This wasn't just visual noise anymore. The sealed fallout shelter, my sanctuary, my only connection to the outside, was becoming a mutable thing. I stumbled back out, pulling the door shut with a heavy thud, hoping to trap the distortion within. I needed proof, something tangible. I grabbed a small, dense metal wrench from a toolkit on the console. I held it out, steadying my hand, focusing. I let go. The wrench didn't fall. It hung in the air, exactly where my fingers had released it, suspended as if caught in an invisible, viscous fluid. For a full 3 seconds, it defied gravity, a silent, impossible testament to the unraveling reality. Then, with a soft clink, it dropped to the floor. My mind raced, trying to find a rational explanation. Magnetic field? No. Air currents? Impossible. It wasn't just affecting my mind. It was actively rewriting the rules within the sealed fallout shelter, turning the very laws of physics into suggestions. This wasn't a hallucination I could simply dismiss. This was a direct, undeniable interaction with the anomalous intelligence. It wasn't merely showing me impossible things. It was making them impossible, manifesting its non-Euclidean nature in the tangible world around me. The sealed fallout shelter, once a fortress against external threats, was now a cage, and the bars were made of shifting perception, of a reality being subtly, horrifyingly reconfigured by something utterly alien. I looked around the control room, the familiar banks of monitors, the blinking lights, the sturdy furniture. Every surface seemed to shimmer with an internal vibration, a silent hum that I felt more than heard. I knew with a horrifying certainty that this was only the beginning. The intelligence wasn't just broadcasting data. It was imposing its existence, bleeding through the fabric of my reality, turning the concrete solidity of the sealed fallout shelter into a malleable, terrifying dream. I was no longer merely observing an anomaly. I was living inside it. They didn't see it. They couldn't. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was a weight, pressing down in the sealed fallout shelter, a physical manifestation of my utter isolation. I pulled my hand back, the sting of rejection sharper than any physical pain. What was the point? To argue with a brick wall, to scream into a void that only echoed my own desperation? No, the answers weren't out there among the oblivious. They were here, in the hum of the equipment, in the shimmering patterns that danced across my screens, in the very air of this underground sanctuary. This sealed fallout shelter, once a refuge, now felt like a crucible. I turned from the dead calms, my gaze drawn back to the main console, where my signal, pulsed. It wasn't just data anymore. It hadn't been for a long time. It was a language, a presence, a growing consciousness that had begun to bleed into my own. The flickering lines, the non-repeating sequences, the impossible geometries that defied every known law of physics, they were no longer just anomalies. They were messages, or perhaps they were eyes. For weeks, I had been the observer, the scientist, meticulously dissecting the signal, attempting to understand its origins, its nature. What if the roles had been reversed? What if I was the specimen? The sealed fallout shelter, designed to protect me from external threats, now felt like a glass terrarium. Every angle of the reinforced walls, every hum from the life support system, every flicker of the fluorescent lights seemed to be part of a grand, elaborate stage. My stage. I stared at the primary display, where a complex, fractal-like pattern writhed. It wasn't just an image. It was a living, breathing entity, communicating through its impossible symmetries. I leaned closer, my breath fogging the cool glass. The patterns seemed to deepen, to draw me in, to become more intricate the longer I watched. Was it reacting to me? There was my scrutiny simply feeding its own. My fingers hovered over the console, a sudden urge to interact directly, to bypass the filters, to strip away the layers of interpretation I'd so carefully constructed. I needed to feel it, not just analyze it. The patterns on the screen seemed to ripple in response, the impossible geometries shifting with a liquid grace. I powered down the analytical subroutines, one by one, until only the raw, unfiltered signal streamed directly to the main display. My eyes ached, my mind struggled to reconcile what it saw with what it knew. And then I saw it, or rather I felt it. It wasn't a face, or an eye, or any recognizable form. It was an awareness. A vast, ancient consciousness that had been present all along, not just within the signal, but around me. It wasn't observing the signal, it was observing me. my every breath, my every thought, my every frantic attempt to comprehend. The patterns on the screen weren't random distortions. They were a mirror, reflecting my own mental state, my confusion, my fear. Every tremor in my hand, every twitch of my eye, every racing beat of my heart was being registered, processed, understood. I was a data point, an experiment, a fleeting curiosity under the gaze of something infinitely old and utterly indifferent. The sealed fallout shelter, with its thick concrete and steel, offered no privacy. The air itself seemed to hum with its presence. The hum of the ventilation system took on a rhythmic quality, a silent, knowing chuckle. I stood there, transfixed, my own consciousness laid bare. The intelligence wasn't trying to communicate with me in a conventional sense. It was studying me, dissecting my reality, observing the very fabric of my perception as it unraveled. My memories, my identity, my fragile sense of self, they were all just data streams, flowing directly into its omnipresent awareness. A profound, terrifying emptiness settled over me. There was no escape, not in this sealed fallout shelter, not anywhere. My mind, my very being, was no longer my own private sanctuary. It was a stage, and I was the unwitting performer, dancing for an audience that spanned beyond the observable universe, an intelligence that saw not with light, but with the raw, untamed essence of reality itself. I was an insect pinned to a board, my frantic struggles merely adding to the data set. The signal wasn't just rewriting my reality, it was consuming my consciousness, piece by agonizing piece, under its unseen, unending gaze.